Hello and welcome to another Tippling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. I am super excited yet again to be joined by Tim White. This is the third interview. I will put the other interviews in the description below. You need to check them out. They are interesting. He's a great guest. He has an intimate knowledge of Ukraine and has indeed recently returned from Ukraine, not without its challenges, talking of itineraries and delays and travel and lack of sleep. But here he is now. Tim, welcome back. How are you? And tell us about your experience of going to Ukraine and coming back.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great to be here again, and Happy New Year to you and all
you.
your subscribers as well. Yeah, good to be back. I kind of lose track of days at the moment. As I said to you privately, I've been doing some tennis commentary, part of my day job, if you like. And that's been taxing, trying to keep up to date with everything that's happening in Ukraine and reporting on it on the Twitter feed. And the trip to Ukraine, which was a little bit of a social trip, but also a working venture too. I was doing some filming over there. A lot of people have covered stuff on the war. I did obviously want to see some of the hotspots, some of the dreadful scenes for myself. And also, I've been getting a few reports, tip-offs from people I know, various channels and friends of friends about a little worried about corruption, a little worried about almost a police state, if you like, occurring in Ukraine now. Now it's martial law and it's understandable. Some people worried that all political parties seem to be being banned, all opposition, and also a lot of businesses being targeted as well. Everything flying under the radar because the only thing anyone's interested in at the moment is the war. Now that is first, second, third, fourth, fifth priority, but at the same time, you don't want discontent among your own ranks. You don't want corruption starting once again in the country, and from a regime that's hopefully going to, and was elected really on the basis of trying to make sure they stamped it out as ordinary people not already immersed in politics. So hoping to have a launch of that, by the way. I will let you know for sure, maybe come on and talk about the film in about a month's time. We're hoping to fix up around about the 13th of February, it looks like, so a diary note there. So the trip to Ukraine was organized. It is difficult to get there these days. I needed my friends over there to organize a few things, transport links and stuff like that, and didn't want to draw too much attention to exactly where we're going. You never know how far the tentacles of the Kremlin reach. Maybe I'm a little bit paranoid. So did the usual thing, investigated all the routes from where I am in the north of England. There's no direct flight anyway to Ukraine in the old days, apart from one Ryanair from Manchester, and that didn't fly every day. And of course, since February, I haven't been back since the war started. I was there the week before and got out the country rather hastily when the Foreign Office told me that I had to leave because all scheduled flights were being taken down by the various companies, as obviously happened. But it was an interesting journey. I flew to Krakow and then had to get 2 trains from Krakow. For those who are interested, even if you're not, I'm going to tell you, there's different rail gauges between the EU and the former Soviet Union. And so you can't stay on the same train. So effectively you have one train to the border town, and then you are all chucked off this train in the middle of the night with your luggage. Predominantly old people. I would say about 70% of the passengers on the train that I was on going to Ukraine from Krakow and from further back as well. It didn't originate in Krakow, the train journey, but they had a lot of luggage with them, very old people, and in the middle of the night, made to stand outside in sub-zero temperatures, as I recall, or about freezing, something like that, for quite a long time, probably a best part of an hour before you go into a little building that acts as a border post, I guess. You have your luggage x-rayed and a stamp in your passport if needed, and then you go through this little building right on the railway station, on the railway track indeed, and there's your train to Ukraine waiting for you, and you get on the Ukrainian train. And it is a quick train, but with it being overnight, I made the schoolboy error of not checking that it wasn't a sleeper train. So there I was thinking, oh, well, I'll be able to get some sleep on this journey. And I didn't, but I was full of adrenaline when I arrived in Kyiv. It was a fairly uneventful journey, thankfully.
Well, I'm just going to mention that gauge thing that you mentioned
Yeah.
is super important, because when you're talking about logistically getting a whole load of material from Europe into Ukraine, and when you're talking about getting stuff out of Ukraine to the rest of Europe, that presents a really big challenge for logistics, for efficiency there. And just that isn't, it's not just a case of unfortunate for passengers having to change trains, but actually is a right nightmare for moving tanks.
Yeah, absolutely. It must be, because wherever they come from, it's usually the easiest way to bring them, and then you've got to offload them all and unload them, if you like, get them onto another train on another gauge. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The train itself, it's a modern train, fairly comfortable, but you're sat upright for the whole journey. As I recall, it's about an 8-hour journey from the border to Kyiv, or back again in the opposite direction. There is no Wi-Fi on board, which I was led to believe there would be. There used to be when I did the train to Lviv previously from Kyiv, but it was a modern train, fairly comfortable. The buffet car was reasonably well stocked. And the only problem on the train that I had was coming back, and I thought it was probably due to the power cuts that were affecting Ukraine really badly at the time of travel. But apparently it was just due to the inclement weather. It was already snowing pretty heavily when I was in Ukraine, good 2-3 inches, 5-6 centimeters in most places. And it got significantly worse as I was leaving, and the storms caused all sorts of problems near the Polish border. And it was that caused my 7.5, 8-hour journey turn into a journey of over 15 hours. At one point, nearly 3 hours we were stuck on the train in complete darkness with no power, no heat. And it wasn't the most pleasant of experience, but it gave me a taste of something that most Ukrainians have gone through and are still going through from time to time. And yeah, I missed my flight home and had to get a new flight. Lufthansa weren't particularly kind to me, giving me a flight at more than full price as a token of goodwill, as they said. In Ukraine, it was more than interesting, to say the least. And I did go very close to the Russian border in Sumy region, a small town village called Svesa, which is only about 10 miles from the border, something like that. And Sumy region has been heavily bombed and continues to be heavily bombed, although not targeting specifically this village. But I did manage to go to pretty much the front line, I guess. There were the trenches there, and troops are stationed there permanently, just in case of any need, any potential invasion over the border in that region.
So
And
just to let people know, Sumy is up there in the northern,
yeah,
sort of northeast, I guess, between Kyiv and Kharkiv. You would have come through Lviv, I take it, on the train
yes.
to get to Kyiv, possibly up this route and down there. That's the train route, and then up to Sumy. So sorry, I just thought I'd give people the context there.
Yeah, absolutely. Dead right. And good geography. I think a lot of people know a lot more about the geography of Ukraine than almost any other country in Europe at the moment, due to the
It's
last.
incredible, yeah.
And most people are getting the pronunciations right now, which after a lot of emails and a lot of phone calls to people, it's nice to see that a lot of broadcasters are taking more care over that. So I was over there to investigate a company that was had been accused of links with Russia and was under sanctions. And they claim that they're being targeted by the regime, which is scoring some political points. So I also, back in Kyiv, went to the Dovzhenka Center, which is a bit of a beacon for film buffs. They actually have a new film museum there as well. And they are also fearing that they're being attacked by unknown corporates. Some suggest a link directly to the president's office as well. So trying to cover all that, did some interviews, did get some downtime there. The question people ask me is, what is it like in Kyiv these days? Really, apart from the occasional air raid warning and seeing half discarded and half moved roadblocks and the old hedgehog anti-tank things around. It's pretty much back to what it was pre-war, really. It's obviously a little less busy, a few more businesses closed, but still you can go and get your shopping, you can go to bars, you can go to restaurants, but there is a curfew, strict curfew, and you have to be home by 9 p.m., which caused immense troubles with my World Cup watching schedule. So I had to watch most of them in my flat, which I managed to do. And you are obviously always wary that there may be power cuts. So I went laden with tea tree candle lights, torches, power banks, and a solar panel generator charger, which I then donated to one of the producers, and one of my good friends out there to help. He's got a young family, so at least I felt I was doing something there as well.
So I guess that there's almost a sense that there's multiple Ukraines in one. So you could imagine living around Lviv and thinking, right, my experience is really different. There's loads of Ukrainians around here. People have come from far and wide in Ukraine to kind of resettle in Lviv because it's safer on the west. And then you get maybe Kyiv and around there is quite different, being the capital and being so important in that respect, but having air raid sirens maybe more frequently than other places in the west. And then you've got the east and all along the front line, which is and that sort of zone around there that is, you're going to have completely different experiences. You know, you live in Kherson Oblast at the moment, you're going to be shelled still and under threat from Russia. So the Ukraine being such a vast country, you'll have so many different experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do notice that the character of the makeup of the people, if you like, changes the further east you go. It gets a lot older because so many people have evacuated from, first of all, Kharkiv as Ukraine's second city, and then all the other satellite places, Poltava and Sumy itself. And down in Kherson now, well, originally not so many people evacuated. It happened so quickly. But now people are evacuating, and there are regular evacuation flights, as they call them, train journeys over to the supposedly safer area in the west of Ukraine. Not always Lviv, maybe Vinnytsia, maybe Uzhhorod, depending on where people want to go. So it is interesting. As I said, this village Svesel that I went to, mainly workers at the big employer, the factory that I went to there, and clearly I would imagine a lot of people have left, but still the men are there predominantly. So there's a very male bias the further east you go as well. People can't leave the country, so not all of them are able to go west. And the poorer people who obviously can't leave, or it's too risky for them to leave in terms of finances, because how are they going to support themselves in another city?
This is a really good point, and something you hear a lot, which is when you look at the occupied towns or towns that have been recently liberated. Ukraine, the latest, did a sort of talked about this quite a bit. They found that the reporter found that actually a lot of the people were old and vulnerable and poor often as well. So these are the people that didn't have the ability or the money or the finances or the connections to get out of Dodge when the Russians sort of came, and so were left there, and they were the ones, you know, who were the most vulnerable and who thus suffered the most as well.
Yeah, it's really horrific. And added to that, when the crisis really bites, when the two armies are virtually on your doorstep, or actually on your doorstep as they have been in Bakhmut and Soledar, where there are still some people in Donetsk where the fiercest fighting has been and where all the headlines are being made at the moment. We then get another situation, as we had in Kherson a couple of occasions recently, of Russia seemingly deliberately targeting distribution points for volunteers, humanitarian aid centers. They have a point that is it becomes widespread known where it will be in advance, because they have to let all the population know. And it seems that maybe one or two Russian sympathizers are finding out about it and revealing this to the Russian forces, and they are shelling mercilessly. A tragic case yesterday, indeed, in Bakhmut. And
I shared your tweet and discussed that in one of my extra videos, and I guess the question is, well, how do we know they're definitely doing that and it's not coincidence, and that would be the defense of the Russians?
Yeah, of course it will be, but it comes back, I guess, to do they know where their missiles are going, or do they just randomly send them in some direction, and are they running out of
They look
intelligence?
bad either way. Either like you are randomly, you've just really inaccurately like shelling places, or you are accurately selling, but you're doing that purposefully, and therefore you're a bastard, or you're a bastard. Yeah.
Well, the Kremlin does love plausible deniability, as we've seen time and time again, to escape the consequences of their actions, and their other adage that all's fair in love and war, and then the whataboutism, oh, but you were shelling Donetsk for 6, 7, 8 years before. So we know what the arguments are, but do I think it's coincidence that 4 distribution points have been targeted in the last month, when I can only remember one in the first 8 months of the war, something like that? Then no, I don't think that's coincidence. I think the absolute embarrassment, hatred the Russians feel at having lost Kherson, the humiliation, they really have been pummeling that city and the liberated part of that region, and they're still in danger there. I mean, the worrying thing for Ukraine is that the muds, the poor weather that was expected, the freezing weather that we've got now would have been much better, has meant that it was very difficult to gain any traction for forces on either side, the same for both. And it has enabled Russia to build what looked like reasonably good defenses, and it will certainly slow down any Ukraine advance if they are determined to stick there and defend the regions that they currently occupy. And you've probably, I think you've covered it as well, haven't you, Jonathan?
Yeah.
The big concrete blocks, if you like, the triangles, the pyramids that have been placed, and there's even the so-called Wagner line, isn't there, in the Luhansk region, going down through Ukraine from the north to the southeast. So it will be difficult for Ukraine to liberate the whole of its territory, but I do still think it's possible, and hopefully it'll be primarily assisted with the disintegration of Russia's defense and falling them out among themselves, which they're already doing. The battles internally between Prigozhin and the Wagner lot, if you want to call them that, and the Shoigu and the actual army, registered army of Russia and the Russian Federation. I did suggest, and I had a little tip off from someone as well, that Shoigu might not be in the job for too much longer. There could be a Kremlin reshuffle this week, so I'm still waiting to see whether that happens either the end of this week or the beginning of next week. But yeah, the objective remains the same for Ukraine: setback in a small town, strategically reasonably important, but nothing compared to Bakhmut when we're talking about Soledar. But in the scheme of things, look at, for anyone who's in support of Ukraine and watching this now, don't be too downhearted if Soledar does completely fall, as I think it either is in the process of doing, or hopefully Ukraine will evacuate its forces if they can get out safely, and it's a reasonable risk to do that. And then they can, at some future point, hopefully fight back in the region with the majority of equipment and hopefully troops still in.
Yeah, I'd so sorry to interrupt, but I think what happens is you get almost, you feel intimately connected. Like we live in this virtual world now, where as you said earlier, we know Ukrainian geography better than we know our own, right? I literally probably do, and or at least certain parts of Ukraine, and you feel in some sense connected to these places like Bakhmut, Soledar, that you're hearing about on a daily basis. That then you feel really bad when these places are lost to the Russians, and you are so close and zoomed in, sometimes literally on a screen, that you forget the whole strategic element to what's going on, and the fact that actually Bakhmut, while that will be a problem, and actually maybe operationally in the area could be fairly significant, but the idea is, do the Russians have actually much capacity and momentum to continue, or they're exhausting themselves on Bakhmut, and then that's they will culminate. You kind of forget to think that, do you know what? It's not the end of the world. Ukraine lost more significant places earlier in the war, and they've regained them since. Don't worry, as sort of I think Zelensky said, we'll get it back type thing. So it's like trying to separate the tactical and the micro from the macro and the strategic.
Yeah, and it's never easy to retreat. And I guess as a president, as the chief of general staff, it must be an incredibly difficult decision, and as Russia has found humiliating. I mean, they abandoned whole swathes, hundreds of, thousands of square kilometers and miles in the end. But for Ukraine, talking about evacuating one town, probably, if it comes to pass, the questions will be asked tactically. Should they have conceded earlier? Should they have probably rescued more troops and gone to make sure that the routes in and out of Bakhmut were more protected, and that the satellite villages around there were in better shape? Because there is still some potential problem ahead for Bakhmut, that it does look pretty secure at the moment from what I'm hearing, but a lot of losses on both sides in Soledar. And the problem for Ukraine is that they do have finite resources in terms of personnel, in terms of men. Now, there may be a mandatory call-up, there may be a wave of mobilization, but Russia can have endless, and they will. Anyone who objects is going to find themselves with a lengthy jail sentence. One of my most recent published stories was about a guy who was actually already there in the army, just complaining about some of the treatment and some of the lack of facilities for the newly mobilized, and he's just been jailed for 5.5 years, even though he signed up, gone there, followed all the orders, was just a bit peed off at how poor the facilities were. And this was in Moscow, and how poor the training was. And you end up getting into a verbal slanging match, and you have 5.5 years jail sentence thrust upon you. It's all part of the fear tactics to make sure that everyone is kept in line. The Russian state media are reporting that. They're not trying to hide it, just to increase that fear factor, just to let people know when that new wave of mobilization comes, you are going to get called up, and you will serve your time with the army and sacrifice your life for the bunker boy, or you'll spend time in the slammer, and it won't be an easy sentence either. I think we can all guess that.
I know, you look at Russian history, they've got good form in throwing humans at a problem. The humans have traditionally been expendable to them in terms of achieving their objectives in war. They will win. At least they see themselves as winning if they achieve a Pyrrhic victory. And
yeah, I think that it's still difficult for many in the West who are slightly more rational and humane, shall we say, because I remember back to 9/11 and the sudden realization that people would actually want to kill themselves because of what they believed in, as long as they took out as many of the perceived enemy as possible. And suddenly we had to refocus as a society to defend ourselves against that. And something I don't think that we've really come to terms with. And I think probably in Ukraine, they do have quite a good handle on this, and the military leaders do now. But as a general public, it's still anathema to us that any leader could just say, as Putin was quoted early on saying, 10,000, 50,000, it doesn't matter. What matters is we win. He does not care about any single person other than himself and those who can materially help him and support him. So whether they lose, whether the figures are right at 112,000, I think we are now, of dead Russians, it could be 500,000, could be 1 million, could be 2 million, could be 3 million. It doesn't matter. The only thing that would matter thereafter, although he's getting so old, he won't be around for that long, even if he did survive the war, and would be the material effect it has on the future of Russia and the production and the economy. And there'll be a huge contraction anyway. I mean, nothing's been spent on society for the good of society anymore. It's all going towards the war. So there's years of hardship to come for Russia, much worse than they're going through at the moment, even if they were to win this war. And with the West still united, then that's got absolutely no chance of happening as far as I'm concerned. The best they can hope for is a long, long war of attrition and try to wear down the Western alliance, which is what they are trying to do. And there is still some danger in that. But even so, I still think that the more far-sighted, and I include our nation, the United Kingdom, the US, and parts now of the French and German leadership are showing strong leadership now to the Spanish, the Italians, and traditionally, obviously, the Eastern European EU states, and also some of the Nordic nations being very strong as well. So I think the stronger nations will continue, even if a couple more countries did Hungary and decided that they didn't upset Putin too much. So,
Because I mean, even Bulgaria has been important with the construction of material or ammunition for Soviet era ammunition. So, and in fact, uh, um, one of their facilities has been hit by the FSB. There have been a couple of explosions over the length of the war because they have been manufacturing much needed ammunition for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, and I mean this is part of the problem in that there are still many pro-Russians, as there were in Ukraine. There have been so many virtual agents. It's the brainwashing that takes place at a low level. So in a lot of those Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, there was this belief, this trust, and this acceptance of Putin until the bombs started going. And then there was a huge change, and people suddenly voluntarily wanted to start to learn Ukrainian. Still, Russia is a predominant language in most of those places, but they are not behind the Russian Federation. They are very, very firmly behind Ukraine. And I went to a place where everyone spoke Russian in Sumy Oblast, didn't hear a single word of Ukraine for the day and a bit I was there. And also in Chernihiv, which we had to pass through to get to Sumy Oblast. And, just because they speak Russian doesn't mean they're not Ukrainian. Americans speak English and they're still Americans, North Americans. Yeah. We should say, so Canadian or US citizens. A language doesn't define a character, a nationality, a passport.
Yeah, and that brings me on to actually a question I was going to ask you. But actually, before I do that, Sabra Burzovic, thank you so much. It's really generous. Such a great discussion. I'm glad that you appreciate this and are getting something out of it. So thank you, Sabra, and also a member of the channel. So really appreciate that. So what I was going to ask you about, did you experience or come across anyone who showed any form of pro-Russian tendencies, or was everyone, and maybe it was just the context that you were in there, that maybe you would have been unlikely to come across anyone like that, but what's your experience of, because I to take that further, I'm worried the eventual end of this war. I think I'm less worried about Crimea, but like areas of the Donbass, how do you liberate areas like that will still have a great degree of brainwashed pro-Russian sentiment?
It is going to be extremely difficult because whoever is shelling civilian parts of the Donbass, particularly Donetsk city, the Russians maintain it's Ukraine doing it, and you would think in a war, well, yeah, it must be Ukraine, but the Ukrainians have almost provably not been responsible, certainly for some of the shelling. I can't say for all, but they're outside of shelling range for some of the missiles that are supposedly landing there where the front line is. So some of that's inconceivable. Some you can find the trajectory. So it hasn't all been Ukraine, but that's no matter. Those who are already in favor of Russia or believing what they're told by the Russian state media that's broadcasting in Donetsk and has been for a while now, and the local media that's controlled obviously by Russia, they're not going to change their minds overnight. They're not going to suddenly be liberated and feel happy about it. So that is going to be a problem. Do you just accept and say, well, we don't want them then? Do we give them a little part that they can live in? No, it doesn't work like that. It's almost exactly what Russia wants, just to pick away little bits, as they did in Georgia, a couple of states, pretend that they're autonomous, and then eventually cede them when it suits them into the Russian Federation. And with Crimea, it suited them straight away for very many reasons, obviously. And then they chose to accept these 4 territories that they call Russian now. But to answer the other part of your question, I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't meet anyone who was pro-Russian. Probably it would be very unlikely to do so because of the people I was mixing with, the area I was in. And also, I'm guessing it's very, very dangerous to express any sort of sympathy for the Russian position. There will be people who are pretending to be ambivalent at best or pro-Ukrainian mildly, who are probably not at all. It is a dangerous society out there, and there are a lot of videos going around of people being tied up, beaten, mainly for looting and things like that. But we don't really know why these punishments are happening. And sometimes the police are letting it happen and then coming along later to arrest the people who are taped to trees, humiliated. I don't like to see anything like that, but it is understandable if people are looting empty houses. But as I said, we don't know exactly why it's happened. That's what's being said. So I think the only way around is to say, yes, there will be incredibly hard times ahead. a lot of money has to be put into these areas when they are liberated in peacetime, to show that there is a better life, that they are better under Ukrainian rule rather than under Russian rule, and that Russia is made to pay as far as possible the vast bulk of the reparations. The West will support as well, and there'll be some ability for Western companies and Western nations to assist and get some companies getting business and hopefully increasing job opportunities there as well. But we have to, you can't see territory to a bully. You can't make a deal because they've already taken some territory when they promised they wouldn't invade. Putin has done it time and again and will continue to do so until he is stopped. And the next leader of Russia is likely to try to do the same as well, unless they're given a bloody nose.
I suppose the real challenge is there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? So when the West and the EU and everyone is giving literally billions of dollars worth of assistance to Ukraine, there will be strings attached. Like, it's very rare that you're like, here's $10 billion. Yeah, it's fine. No, just have it. Right? It's not a problem. There you go. There's free $10 billion. That's not going to happen. So it's like, here's a bunch of money or here's some assistance, but we need you to open up this for our businesses. We need you to do that. So I worry that going forward, but I don't know that there's any solution to this. You couldn't have it any other way because Ukraine need help. No one has so much money that they can just give it away willingly. So you can understand why there would be strings attached, but you wonder whether going forward, and this would be part of the pro-Russian narrative, whether Ukraine will be somehow beholden to the West and kind of constrained by the West in terms of being in their pocket.
That is part of the narrative for sure, and it chimes well with Ukraine's just the 51st state of the USA or whatever they're doing at the time. You know, it's just being ruled by Brussels, it's being ruled by Britain, whatever, it changes. But the message is the same, that Ukraine has been taken away from the brotherhood that it should have with Russia, as the narrative goes from an increasingly fascistic regime in the Kremlin in Moscow. But business can help to rebuild, Western business, whatever business. There has to be business, there has to be jobs there. And the quickest way to get a city back on its feet is to get investment in, to get the building materials. And Ukraine won't be able to do that on its own. And if it did, it would have to take out huge loans and resort to ridiculous interest payments when the country is already going to be almost bankrupt. So the Lend-Lease deal is a good example. Yeah, we can help you, and afterwards there will be some help back. And the Ukraine will grow from this, and it'll grow way faster than Russia, and it will end up growing more quickly than it would have done, I think, probably if we take it over a 20-year stretch, a generation stretch. I think Ukraine will ultimately be in a better, stronger financial position and more secure in its future than it would have been had there been no war, but had there still been this aggressive bear carrying on in a part of the territory that no one was willing to stand up for in the West, in Donetsk and Crimea for that matter as well. So there's reasons to be positive, and we shouldn't shy away from our willingness to help, albeit Western businesses making a little bit of profit on the back of that.
Yeah, and I guess the hope, I mean, looking positively, is that the people of Ukraine have shown that they have a great resilience and great innovative like character and problem solving, that actually there will be some transferable skills. There will be some, you know, there's a pool of human resources in Ukraine that will be, you know, useful on the employment stage and economically. So, you know, there is hope for Ukraine, obviously, with assistance from the West. So what, talking about, because your documentaries, it seems to be partly about this or largely about this, talk to us about the idea of Zelensky making authoritarian rules. And because we need to be careful in times of war, you need to have these very strict laws passed to protect yourself in certain situations. So you can understand why you would want certain authoritarian rules to be made. But has Zelensky overstepped the mark? Some people are saying he's gone too far in certain areas. What was your experience of this?
I think the narrative at the end of it is, I don't think it's particularly Zelensky, and he has done some incredible things. And it could just be a case that when you make such pretty necessary sweeping laws, when you're living under martial law 24/7 for virtually a whole year now, then some people are going to get caught up accidentally, some peripheral damage, if you like. Shouldn't really use a war term for that context, but maybe it is that. Maybe it's something a little bit deeper. The jury is still out. There's no conclusive proof. What we do know is some people clearly feel victimized. There is still corruption in Ukraine. You don't get rid of it overnight. We've still got corruption here. Every country has some corruption. It's under a microscope in Ukraine right now, and it will certainly be after the war. And Russia is trying to push the narrative that all this equipment's going missing and lots of fundraising and not all of it makes the front and things like that. But it's very small compared to how it used to be. There has definitely been improvements in the corruption scheme of things, but it is still quite prevalent in Ukrainian society, or it was on day one of the war, and it will still be now. So I do understand, and I do back martial law, and I do understand the outlawing of overtly pro-Russian political parties and shall we say, broadcasts of malice and anything that endangers the population should not be broadcast either. But I think it's very important to maintain plurality, to maintain an open society, and prove that you are not just mimicking what Russia did, even during martial law. I think you have to be confident enough in doing the right thing to allow all criticism. And I think Ukraine is trying to do that. Some people have mentioned a certain person within the government's entourage. I mean, already we've seen quite a lot of complaints, and even some MPs fleeing to Russia from Zelensky's own party. So it's a very, very difficult, tangled web at the moment. And remember that this guy who has no political experience until suddenly moving from the small screen with his production company to becoming a real life president as opposed to a fictional one. But he was pretty much put there by an oligarch. And although he wasn't an oligarch himself, he still has that production company, and most of his inner circle are from that production company. There's so little political experience, but on the war footing, they have got the experience of the generals. Poroshenko, for all his faults, did a really good job in getting the army into some sort of ship-shape fashion when it was a bit of a shambles at the start of the 2013-14 conflict. I say 2013 because that's really when the Russian interference started over Maidan and with Yanukovych. So it was in decent shape heading into the war. Also, I think the Western Alliance had helped. The US and UK had certainly been helping. There'd been training, there'd been advice given to Ukraine for quite a long time. And the war effort has been managed well. And the communications, exemplary. And it was always going to be thus, I guess, with a good communicator, someone who's worked in the media for so long. So there's very many positives, but we're just trying to keep an eye on one or two of the making sure that there's no real injustices done, and that Ukraine is kept a very free nation in all aspects, and there's no clampdown on the media, because at the moment you have a situation where you get to Ukraine and there's just one TV broadcast about the war that continues, the TV marathon as they call it, and all the news organizations, all the broadcasters join together for this one channel, which is good because it means everything's centralized. There's not other people making different claims. So a lot of good, but just still a few
challenges along there.
Worry.
I mean, it's worth remembering, because I remember getting challenged over this and saying, look, I was saying that Zelensky is on a war footing here. This is Ukraine is in the middle of the war, obviously, and so therefore you can understand why you would want to shut down overtly pro-Russian political parties. And some people saying, oh, that's not freedom of speech. It's like, okay, know your history. World War II, Oswald Mosley in the UK was your fascist leader. He ended up getting imprisoned. In fact, the party that came out of the party that he started was involved in ended up getting shut down. There were shut down parties in World War II, because you can't be having a war against the Nazis. This is World War II in Britain. You can't have a war against the Nazis and then have a Nazi party like being represented in Parliament. That's in some kind of ideal utopia. Obviously, this wouldn't be happening anyway, but you may have that kind of overt pluralism, but realistically, that ain't going to happen. So that you're absolutely right. Zelensky shutting down pro-Russian parties is obviously something that's going to happen in this kind of situation. Anyway, that's my tuppence.
Yeah, I just seen in the chat a lot of messages coming through, which is nice to see, and we are trying to read them. Lee's just said, Lee Dixon, who also earlier in the chat I noticed said that his wife speaks Russian, was from the east of Ukraine, as I recall. And yeah, I speak.
She's from Poland, but her family's Ukrainian.
Okay, but he's also yeah. I spoke only Russian. My Ukrainian's so bad that I survived on Russian. No one challenged me about it. No one said speak English, speak Ukrainian, please. But I have noticed most of my friends who were speaking Russian, if they were speaking Russian, have now switched to Ukrainian in their everyday conversations. So just lost Lee's comment. So he said, this is from Lee Dixon. What did you mean about corruption before? As I'm worried about how it will go down politically in the US and the Republican Party. Well, think of the corruption that happens in the United States, then, to use that example, because there is corruption there. And I would just say that Ukraine had exactly the same, a little bit worse, because they were only part way along the road to reform, and reforms were happening, not as swiftly in some aspects as people wanted. There is still everyday life corruption. If your mother or father got ill, you would usually have to pay to make sure that you were seen quickly enough by a doctor. If you happen to be in hospital and you wanted them to have decent care, the hospital care is free, but it's just everyone knows that you have to pay to get a nurse to look after them properly. So there is that low level of corruption. And if there's that low level, there's obviously going to be much higher levels of corruption as well. And the corruption that I was looking into was making sure that companies aren't able to trade as they should be by various blocks, various tactics, blocking money getting to them. And then when they're on the verge of potentially going out of business or needing help, you step in and get a majority shareholding, and you can buy the company for a very low fee. And then you can, if you were after the land, demolish the buildings they're on. That's the fear of the Dovzhenko Center in a very very good area of Kyiv that's been redeveloped. And the accusation there from people associated with the Dovzhenko Center is that someone wants to knock it down, and that someone within the government circles is probably helping them to make sure that the Dovzhenko Center has to move somewhere else when they don't want to move, and they've got this fantastic facility very near the center of the city. So it's that sort of corruption we're talking about, Lee. But further up, I'm sure there are people that are more corrupt. It's a question of, over time, making sure that corruption becomes totally acceptable from the top down and from the ground up.
Yeah. And I just, just to talk about corruption, I did talk about this on one of my videos. Here's the Corruption Perceptions Index, 2021 figures. You got your Nordic state, New Zealand, Nordic states at the top, Singapore. Then we get down 11th, the UK. Interesting, the US, corruption perception. 27th, but actually when you're talking about Ukraine, and this is how much of a challenge corruption is in Ukraine, this is before the war really, all the way down, I think in around about 120, where they're somewhere around goodness, I probably, yeah, they are 122nd.
Yeah,
122nd there, but Russia is 136th. So Russia, I mean, these are perceptions of corruption. It's hard to objectively quantify that, but before the war, it was a recognized problem, corruption in Ukraine. Everyone knew it was a big problem, and in fact, Zelensky set himself as that being one of his major targets, and that is something, work on that necessarily needs to continue through the war. And in fact, with so much close, this might be one of the benefits of the West giving a bunch of money and assistance to Ukraine, is that some of the strings attached will be, yeah, we'll give you these billions of dollars, but you need to sort out your corruption. So we want to see this in place, and this in place, which
that's
then means
exactly what has been happening, Jonathan. Sorry to interrupt, but the ECB has made that as well. And yeah, the US will make sure that the purse strings are tightened if it doesn't come to pass. And go back a little bit further for those of you who've only joined in the Ukraine following since the war. There was an openly pro-Russian, Russian-financed, Russian-backed president, democratically elected. Could tell you a whole story about how that happened and the failures of Ukraine society. But in 2013, the Maidan revolution began because people wanted to move further west. They were getting very tired of being tied to Russia and being basically almost still ruled by Russia. and in a democratic society, it was clear that the majority of people wanted to move further west. And Yanukovych had almost promised that, and then suddenly went back on his word, didn't refuse to sign the association agreement with the EU, and then chose to go with Russia and Putin's sudden arrival on a white knight carrying a whole load of problems for Ukraine, but a whole bunch of money for Yanukovych and his cronies. So that brought about the revolution. And from that moment onwards, having not really ousted, he fled the country. That's, again, me using Russian terminology. He wouldn't stand up to the people. He wouldn't be tried. He knew that he was guilty, and Yanukovych fled the country and left Ukraine without a president. That's why they had to elect a new one. So from that moment, they tried to tackle corruption less than 10 years ago. And virtually from that moment, a war has started. Little green men started appearing in Crimea. Whole hosts of Russian provocateurs came over. They were paying money to groups of armed thugs to foment trouble in virtually all the eastern towns and cities. Kharkiv survived, Dnipro survived and remained pro-Russian, but they did take over large parts, as we know, of Luhansk and Donetsk, and by that time Crimea had already fallen to the Russians.
And of course, one of those people was Igor Girkin, or Igor Strelkov, who ended up, being the military leader of the separatists in 2014, and he is now prominent.
Can we just say war criminal there after he was found officially guilty in the trial?
Yes, of course. He had literally just been found. Yeah, he is now a war criminal found guilty of the shooting down of the passenger plane MH17. So he is now, interestingly, he went to the front line, then came back because they didn't really want him there. There was some issue with the fact that his papers went through or whatever. So he's now back to being a military blogger. But he's also being very critical at the moment. I'm going to do something in one of my next videos, because he's just had a big tirade, I think, against Putin. So there is this interesting situation in the information space of Russia, where you've got Putin, and then you got Shoigu, and there's like maybe some tension between them. They've traditionally been friends, and that's why Shoigu's in that position, but Shoigu's not really doing a very good job. And then you got Prigozhin trying to position himself maybe as the new defense minister, but then Putin's kind of wary, is like, this guy is Kremlin, but not Kremlin. He's actually, Wagner used to be illegal. Now they're not. Now they've got a nice shiny building. And then you've got the military bloggers who are kind of slagging everyone off, who aren't being harsh enough in the war. So you got someone like Igor Girkin saying Putin and the army are doing a terrible job and we need to do much better. No one knows what the objective is, because actually no one seems really to know what the objective is for the Russians. I mean, is there anything to say to that kind of chaos? And also, what do you think, and I know I've asked this on previous videos, but again, what do you think that the Russian objective presently is?
A lot to tackle there, Jonathan.
Yeah, sorry, mate.
So, I think Putin is so paranoid. I mean, you've seen even when he has meetings with his closest confidants, you're about 60 feet, 15, 20 meters away on that shambolic table that's been specially made for him. So he doesn't trust anyone. He likes having people who will support him. He likes the lick-spittle sort of people. But when they become too powerful, they need to be wary of themselves, and then their head is above the parapet. And Prigozhin's at that position now. So will he become a real threat to Putin? And I think he is. Is he shaping up to have a presidential run? I think he's testing the waters. I think he's in that position to be able to, but he won't dare go against Putin at the moment. But that's a possibility. And that could see a lurch further, I don't want to say left or right, but to the extreme and to the violent. Also interesting, you mentioned about it used to be illegal, the Wagner group. I think in the Russian constitution, and that its mercenaries are still illegal, and yet this is a private military contractor. They call themselves that. PMC is the transliteration. So yeah, rules only matter when they can be applied against your opponents.
Well, the Russians have literally just, so Putin's just changed the rules that you can commit crimes, and basically as long as it's in the advance of the war effort, then that's fine. We'll just waive those. So he's basically saying anyone in the occupied territories and anyone in the army can do whatever they want, basically. And if you can show that that crime that you've committed, shooting a civilian in the back of the head, you could imagine, raping people and all these kind of things. Like, if you can argue that's in the benefit for the war effort, then hey, that's okay by me. I mean, it's terrible.
Yeah, of course, raping people always is an essential part of winning a war on the battlefield, isn't it? Just awful thinking some of the things happen, and it did bring it home to me when I was actually in the scene of the first lot of atrocities, horrendous things that we heard about being around Bucha and Borodyanka. I spent quite a bit of time in Irpin, Hostomel. Quite surprised at just how much damage there was in Hostomel. It was almost overlooked. Had a fantastic long interview and long sit down for most of one afternoon with a political commentator out there who was actually holed up in his house on a private gated community. Very nice place, lovely house, lovely street. Very few people there, apart from the Russians who just moved into this gated community, and he was forced to just let them in his house when they wanted. He was told they'd leave him alone. They scrawled Ljudi, the Russian word for people, all over his house to make sure that he wasn't targeted. But he was, I said, did you feel safe? He said, I went to the commander the first day I realized what was really happening and that I had to make sure I lived. And his family had already evacuated to the west of Ukraine, by the way. And so there's this guy, quite elderly, I don't know exact, 64, 65 maybe. And he said he just went to the commander and said, how do I live? And he said, don't wear any fatigues, don't wear anything with pockets that could conceal things, and just be friendly to us and open the door as soon as we knock on your door. And pretty much that was it. But he said they came in, they stole things, they demanded that he made them food or opened his fridge and just took what they had at times. And they were literally camped in the fields of these private houses. So that was another thing. But
which there's a really interesting discussion to be had around that, which is when you talk about retribution being taken on collaborators, that there will be an awful lot of collaborators who would have worked with the Russians because not necessarily, I mean, I am speculating here, but not necessarily because they had pro-Russian sentiments, but because actually it was self-preservation. And then how do you deal with people like that who are like, well, it's either I'm going to get killed by these guys or I'm going to work with them, or at least, be seen to work with them. Is that a punishable effect? There's all sorts of moral quandaries to be had around
there is. I think most people would agree what the line to be crossed is and isn't. I think, if you're actively helping, then yeah, that is punishable. If you've chosen to take any sort of position, job that is to the benefit of the invaders, then yeah, that's way beyond the line. If you're someone who's just trying to survive and is not trying to fight off a military unit armed at your door from raiding your fridge, then I don't think that can be deemed as cooperating or collaborating. But yes, some people for their own enrichment and benefit will certainly, we've seen in Kherson and some of the other regions, have certainly been to the fore trying to collaborate actively, knowing that they could quickly flee to Crimea or wherever else they needed to if things turned bad, as indeed they have been doing in that part of the world, in southern Ukraine. And a lot of people have escaped to the peninsula of Crimea.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what other experience? I mean, you said you went to Bucha and nearby. What other experiences do you have? What other sort of anecdotes to kind of like sum up your experience, or what you understood to have happened around there?
Well, obviously, my family were incredibly worried, my friends as well, about what was happening. And I didn't actually tell my wife that I was going so close to the border until afterwards, and I was back in Kyiv in relative safety. But I felt like I was probably more in danger on the roads because of just total ice roads and with very little traffic as well. It's an experience driving for 6-7 hours. Of course, no street lights. You forget what how difficult it is driving with almost zero light once the sun goes down. That was quite an experience, and that probably frightened me more than anything. Not particularly frightened, but I was like thinking, I'm glad I'm not driving this trip, and I was being driven.
Can I just interrupt? Just sorry, but this is nothing to do with Ukraine, right? But I watch quite a bit of TV and movies and stuff, and it really annoys me. And I was watching Jack Ryan on Amazon with my partner the other night, and they were in the jungle, right, at night, and they're doing all this fighting, and you can still see everything because there's a light source somewhere up there, which is the moon or something. But every film or movie, because necessarily you need to see the characters, when people are in the dark, you can always see them. But real darkness is like, and you will know that from being out on those roads in Ukraine with no lights, is, dude, you can't see anything unless you've got your own light source. So yeah, I understand why you have to do this for TVs and movies, but come on, be realistic. I just want to see a black screen of people just walking into, bumping into trees. But anyway, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I think you'd have to limit that to about 15 seconds, but yeah, I do get your drift. But the overriding thing, and one of the things that I did, I met one of the people who'd helped us with the collection that we organized. We did a fundraiser, and it was fantastic to finally meet her. She did a lot of good helping get the stuff that we bought, predominantly winter.
Which is what, for who?
This was for a couple of the units where we had personal acquaintances, friends, and that we knew that one of them in particular was struggling to get gear. The shops obviously are all sold out. It was just really difficult, even for relatives, to buy things, and very expensive. So on Twitter, we raised quite a lot of money. I can't remember the exact amount, something like $6,500, I think, because it was either in euros or dollars that we had to spend the money to get the goods. And yeah, it was sent to the front line, to troops fighting on the front line. A lot of boots we managed to get, which they were so grateful for. Winter, just socks, white camouflage for the winter ahead. And this was delivered end of October, beginning of November from memory. And it was the first time I've been back. So the first time I actually met face to face with one of the big helpers, which was great. And met a couple of new guys in the army, one of whom we're following each other now on Twitter. And these people just have ordinary lives. You know, the guy was a photographer and trying to get into editing film and things. And suddenly he just had to volunteer, and he was a volunteer, and he's now in the army full time, and just such a nice, smart, intelligent young man defending his country. And the overriding feeling you have when you leave, and everyone says the same, is just the immense pride that people have in their army and in their country, and the absolute belief that they will win. And also, I think the hardships that they're going under, and you think, goodness me, how do people cope? It's minus 18 in some parts of Ukraine at the moment, and still they will have hours and hours with no heating and no lighting. But the people, almost to a man, woman, and child, say, yeah, but the suffering we have, we're cold for a few hours, we can put blankets on, at least we're not being bombed here, we're not being shot out. It's the guys in the front line who are having it much, much worse. And that's true. But it does take a united nation to come with that, and the media play out of this war, and the excellent management in terms of media appearances and social media from the Ukrainians is really helping. The nation would have been united without that, I guess, because it isn't just about the war; it's about what's in your head and the passion for your country, and a country that has been suppressed and occupied for the majority of its history, but has always existed. To have finally got real freedom just 3 decades ago, but to still see that that wasn't really free, although they had their own constitution, flag, national anthem, they were still controlled for much of that time by Russia, certainly influenced at first and directly controlled. And so the real taste of freedom has only come for most people within the last decade, the last 9 years, when democracy has really flourished. And it showed that a peaceful president who'd done a lot of good for the country in many respects, Poroshenko, a lot of people were just fed up that things weren't moving quickly enough. Some were fed up with him. He still had some business in Russia, which didn't do him good. He was still an oligarch, and they saw a fresh face and voted out with a huge margin a sitting president. And that just does not happen where democracy is not free and flourishing. So it was testament to Ukraine that happened, and that Poroshenko, although again a little bit worried about some of the things that have been seen to be targeted on him, I would like him to be a key figure in the opposition and allowed to argue freely with the president when the time comes in future after the war. But the unity of the people, the feeling of like, well, I have to suffer, it's my duty, I have to go through these power cuts because it's helping Ukraine, it's helping our guys in the front. We have to do what's right for the country, and we will do anything. And you've heard Zelensky say this: I'd rather be without water than be Russian. I'd rather be without everything. I'd rather be without life than be with Russia. And it is that they will stand and fight to the last man, woman, and child to avoid being occupied again.
What you were saying earlier, I wrote this piece right back in February the 27th. So bear in mind they'd only been invaded February the 24th, or something like this was Putin meant to destroy Ukraine's identity. Instead, he's massively enhanced it. So even at that early time, you were seeing Ukraine flag put up everywhere. People were starting to talk about Ukraine. We moved from the Ukraine to Ukraine, like as people once called it, the Ukraine, because they saw it as a part of Russia and all of this. And so I wrote a piece saying that actually, if Putin's intentions then were to, wipe Ukraine off the face of the earth and assimilate it into the Russian Empire, into the old Soviet Union as was, then actually he's utterly failed, because they have now, and so now forward wind almost a year, and Ukraine have such a sense of identity. They're such a unified country. The language, the culture, the food is, all these kind of identity markers are suddenly front and center, and Ukraine has become culturally its own thing, almost as a direct result. It would never have been so strong had they not been invaded. So, what an own goal from Putin.
Yeah, and the fact that NATO's become expanded and more united. And I read one of the comments, Michael Deaton, I think it was, here we go, agreeing with Euler Greg, whose text you put on screen, I think, earlier, Jonathan, saying Ukraine stops World War III at the birthing stage. Let it fall and Poland will be next, and that's NATO directly involved in the next great world war attained. That's very true. And also not just there, of course, a lot of Russians still live in the Baltic states, a minority there, but they've been trying to foment trouble there for years and years and years. And Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, but particularly Estonia, I think, is the most vulnerable to Russian peace, Ruski Mir, paying them a visit. And that's something that obviously we all want to avoid. There is no sense to it. But there was no sense in Putin invading Ukraine. But for whatever reason, be it, he felt that there was going to be trouble ahead domestically and he needed to show his strength, or whether he was just simply bored or stupid and none of his advisors actually gave him the truth. Who knows what? But a man approaching the end of his life, and I'm not saying that he is terminally ill, as some people are saying. There's absolutely no proof of that. But
although it does look like he's on steroids, it's quite, he's puffy faced out there. There's a lot of really good evidence to.
There's a lot of arguments in favour of that can't be disproven. I would certainly go that far. And he probably does have Parkinson's. You'll see that he's almost always gripping on with his right hand, in particular, to something to presumably stop it shaking. Or
they're often in his pockets as well. And
And I do worry about what comes afterwards, because every possible, not even liberal figure, just a normal figure, has pretty much been eliminated from the surroundings, because he's surrounded himself purely with sycophants. And if anything, as you've suggested already, with the likes of Prigozhin and the so-called war bloggers and Igor Strelkov-Gurkin, it's become even more increased, this hatred and this desire for more bloodshed and more war and more weapons. And a lot of these people calling for use of tactical nukes, as they are known, on Ukraine. So you do worry about who comes next. But I think Prigozhin's probably played the best card so far. Patrushev, a lot of people are talking about as a potential successor, but that's probably for another outing, I would think. Maybe appearance 4 or 5 on your show.
Yeah. So just to as we come to the end here and wrap things up, you were just saying something then. There's a really good piece in the week talks about who are the contenders who would replace Putin, and in fact. Oh no, it's gone behind the paywall now. But the guy that you just mentioned, is it Prushev and then a couple of the others? The talk is that they are arguably, one of them's quite old now, but he's more fascistic and more nationalistic than Putin is. So you're exactly right. He's got rid of all the reasonable people, and the ones who might replace Putin are like worse choices than Putin. So that ain't good.
And let's just say, of course, a lot of people are saying, well, Navalny, get him out of prison, but he also has if you look into his character and what he stood for in the past, what would, for most people in the Western Alliance, be unacceptably extremist views. So there's just no one within Russia at the moment that has the experience and any sort of clout and following with the public. I mean, ideally, you'd like some sort of coalition involving someone from the current regime who actually sees the sense and sees how to rebuild Russia, and the likes of Kasparov, now exiled in the US.
Well worth following on Twitter for those who don't.
Yeah, fantastic guy, such an eminent figure. And speaks the truth and has lived through the communist years and was in real danger of being arrested and probably executed by Putin. Khodorkovsky, don't agree with all his views, but exiled in London, who served a decade, was it, in prison before his sentence was commuted by the president ahead of the Sochi Games, was it, as I recall? But a coalition of brains would be ideal, but it's a pipe dream, I'm afraid, for those of us. I still have so much admiration for Russia as a country in many respects, and the art, and but just the hatred and the warmongering and the imperialistic attitude. It just not just leaves me cold, starts to engender hatred in me, and that's something that I don't want to have in me. I want Russia to be back to a peaceful nation, and one that is able to flourish in its own right, and more so that Ukraine is a more advanced and succeeding much more in future years than its big brother over the border.
I really understand those sentiments. So the very last question, and thank you so much for the lively live chat at the side. Really appreciate that. Last question would be, I know I ask this to you each time, but where do you see this going in the short, medium, long? What has anything changed in your idea, or is it just more of the same?
The worry now is that the Western Alliance is not getting the weapons that have been promised quickly enough to the front, and I think I probably underestimated myself just how difficult it would be. It's one thing making the announcement, but as we've seen, they're just deciding about the Patriot missile air defense. How are they going to train Ukrainians, and how long that will be? Can we train them in the? Oh, maybe that will be upsetting. Does that involve us directly in the war and all this sort of thing? So I think that I underestimated that. And it does mean that Russia is probably in a better position to make this war drag on. But when I was in Ukraine, I was saying that May could be a big turning point and potentially the end of the war. I do think that the number of people dying has to sooner or later have a social impact. And I think the next round of mobilization, when it was called, may be a tipping point, which is why they're trying to avoid it. They won't want to close the borders.
But the problem is they've got such a strong control over internally. So there are more internal security services than there are army in Russia. So they have a really strong, I almost mentioned this earlier when you talked about this in some way, but they had a chance where a whole unit was pretty much wiped out, and all the mothers were like, we want to speak to Putin. And he said eventually he agreed to speak to them, but it turned out they actually spoke to fakes, and they were all like plants around the table, and he didn't really speak to those mothers. So there's no opportunity for that dissatisfaction with Putin and the war to ferment in Russia in a public way that you really hope it would. And that's what you want.
It did, though, didn't it, in Afghanistan? And different times, but there was no internet in those days. That was just from anger fermenting from within, and then being so angry you didn't care about discussing it with your neighbor and finding out, well, there's 3 people on our street who've lost their sons or husbands or whatever. And with the internet, no matter how much they try to control it, Telegram is still open. There are always ways of communicating. There are always wizards being able to beat the system and the controls. And I think eventually there is going to be some sort of snowball effect, and from a little protest will grow bigger and bigger protests. How do you hide the graves? I mean, how many people are going to be buried in Saratov after the Makiyivka, where they said 89 people died after the Ukraine pinpoint bombing on the school housing 600, 700 mobilized, 610 died, I think.
Yeah, you posted that intercept as well, didn't you? So there's an intercept. I haven't shared this with my viewers yet, but there's an intercept that came out yesterday, I think, that of a Russian phone call back to someone, I think, back in Russia, saying that I was involved with the trucks that were taking he said there were 12 Kamaz trucks just ran full of bodies, and he said there's 610 people had died, and that's that, and that's an intercept. Now, is that propaganda? Could be. But it does also confirm what the Ukrainians have been claiming, and the Russians have themselves said that they're going to refuse to give the latest figures on the dead from Makivka because they don't want it to be, used by foreign intelligence services.
True. I got a bit off topic though, didn't I? And that was, how do I think it'll end if I have a crystal ball? So I do think that there will be some sort of domestic problems for Russia, and that will lead to the tipping point. And then you've got the ability, and he so far distanced himself from any problems. Remember, Putin has still not made any comment about Makivka. He didn't make any comment about the withdrawals when they happened in Kharkiv and in Kherson. So he only comments on the good, only wants to be associated with the good. But sooner or later, the generals, Prigozhin's, his opponents will see that the public are pinning this on him because it was his decision to invade. He sat there telling us on the night of the 25th of February that this was going to happen, 24th February, and it happened in the early hours of the 25th. And so as soon as that moment is reached, and a couple of the underlings, as they are at the moment, the likes of Patrushev, maybe even Medvedev might turn against him, the former president, who's suddenly, from being one of the more liberal figures in the Russian political elite, to becoming as hate-filled as anyone with some of his rantings on Twitter and elsewhere. And if these people suddenly decide that, well, A, Putin is vulnerable, and B, he's a liability, then everything changes. And then my hope is that whoever comes in realizes that it's a war they're not going to win. It's draining money. It will leave them open to the same sort of protests that helped bring down Putin. And therefore, any sensible leader would then blame it all on Putin and say, yes, Crimea is Russian. We're in danger of losing that because of what Putin did, because our army has been almost wiped out in places. Tens of thousands have died. It's a horrendous situation. We're going to publish all the lists because all parents deserve to know. We're not going to hide about what happened to the Moskva, the sunken cruiser early in the war, and all the other tragedies. We're going to publish the names from Makiyivka and show you just how bad it is and how bad the organization was. And I, as the new leader, am going to make sure that we have a properly strong Russia, but we're not going to have enemies. We are still going to have our own culture. We are still going to have Crimea. And I think the likes of France and Germany, as they have done in the past, will push for a settlement, and probably the United States will as well. Britain, Poland, the Baltic states probably won't, but I think that the bargaining chip eventually will be Crimea. And I think that Ukraine will be forced to accept losing Crimea, possibly as an absolutely independent, autonomous nation, not just a state. Maybe that's an acceptable kind of hybrid challenge with links to both parties, both the other former controlling states, and trade with both Ukraine and with Russia. That's one potential solution. But I think that all wars end sooner or later with some sort of negotiation with a new leader, even if he's won. And that could be a step too far. But I think Ukraine will regain all its territory. The problems that have to be overcome in Luhansk and Donetsk are manifold. But if you had a referendum in Crimea now, most people would actually genuinely vote in favor of Russia, because most people who lived there, who were in favor of Ukraine, have left.
Yeah.
And it will be more or less the same in Donetsk as well, that people have been either forced to flee or have voluntarily fled. So referendum.
Yeah, and that is the challenge. Yeah, absolutely agree with that.
So we've got to change hearts and minds, but first of all, we've got to have a plan in place that doesn't have to be in public, of course, but Ukraine and the allies have to know what the plan is in various scenarios. And I think the one most likely is that internal pressure, domestic pressure, will lead to Putin falling out of a window, or having a nasty cup of tea, or having a surprise heart attack, or something of the same, or agreeing to stand down literally at the barrel of a gun and live out his life like Gorbachev did. That's what I predict. And I think that if Ukraine can get some momentum going and start attacking and showing that the new defensive lines, particularly if it's not already taken by then in the rest of Kherson and Zaporizhia, then I think we can look to a spring real change in momentum, and therefore I think May could be a tipping point sometime in May. So remember these words. You can laugh at me on the 31st of May when nothing has changed, but that's about as good as I can hope.
I don't think we'd laugh. We'd cry. But we need to help them win, not to help them not lose. So I think for me, that's a really big step change that I think we're going to start seeing now.
It's too late. Well, it's not too late, but it's tens of thousands have died, hundreds of thousands have died on both sides, and a lot of innocent people, and it didn't need to happen. And it's happened because of intransigence, because of being scared of Putin and Russia. And some states are more guilty than others. Poland, the UK, the United States slightly behind, but now doing an amazing effort. But why didn't we do this? Why didn't we do this in 2014 when Crimea was invaded? The UK and the US. That administration, and we were legally obliged to protect. We signed to say we would protect Ukraine, and we didn't. We did nothing. Just one unit, one battalion would have sorted that out on Crimea, but it didn't. So here we are today, and hopefully lessons have been learned.
Yeah, and it's not being afraid of the nuclear button being pressed. I don't think that's. I think now that everyone's thought that's probably not going to happen, it kind of allows people to go, okay, now we'll start giving. But no, look, Tim, thank you. I know we've gone a bit over what we said we would, but I really appreciate you spending time with us. And I really appreciate your expertise. And there's obviously so much more you can talk about your experiences in Ukraine, because we barely even scratched the surface, I'm sure. But really looking forward to seeing the eventual product of that. Please, everyone watching, follow Tim on TWMC Limited if you are on Twitter. He's well worth following, really important. Part of my daily routine, along with so many brilliant people on Twitter. But thank you, Tim. What are your final words?
I just keep the faith, keep the pressure on your government if you're living in a country where they're not fully supporting Ukraine, and keep letting people know the truth of the situation, because you will be surprised how much propaganda there is and how many people are employed full time by the Kremlin and by their allies overseas to make it appear that Ukraine is bad or the Western Alliance is bad. Don't forget those scenes that you saw on your TV screens in Bucha and Borodyanka. Don't forget the number of rapes, the number of civilians shot in the head just walking along the street, cars shut up. Remember those things, and make sure other people remember. This is the true horror of an unjust and illegal war. Hopefully, with the continued aid at this sort of level, the stronger the aid is, the quicker it is, the shorter the war will be, and the more lives ultimately will be saved. But thanks for Jonathan, and thanks also to everyone who has contributed to the discussion. Sorry we couldn't get through everything. And follow me on Twitter if you have any specific questions. If you just search Tim White Ukraine, I should come up, I think, and you can send me a message on there by all means.
Fabulous stuff. Well, I think half of those employees you were talking about of Putin, those Russian bots are flooding my YouTube threads at the moment. I seem to have reached a tipping point where they're all attacking. But anyway, thank you. Brilliant stuff. And thank you, everyone else. Thanks to Sub Robertovich for the kind support of the channel. Really appreciate that. And for all of your support. Fantastic. And please look out again. Hopefully I'll get Tim on again for number 4 to see how his projects are progressing, and to get his opinions and ideas. Really appreciate that. In the meantime, everybody, Take care, and thank you, Tim.